mentioning something else that went on in the 90s that also helped put the worst on top. That was the threats of lawsuits over racial discrimination. The Boston Federal Reserve, no less, came up with research showing that black people were not getting mortgages to the extent that white people were. Ergo, the bankers are racist. Now, look, it's possible that that people put profits before put their racist hatreds before profits. But bear in mind that if you're a mortgage banker, your purpose is to find good, credit-worthy customers, because that's the business you do. You give out mortgages to credit-worthy people. That's the way you make profits. And if you're going to discriminate against anyone, you're going to say no short people, no women, no blacks, no whoever, you are hurting your own business. So one would wonder, Thomas Sowell is, of course, most famous for having made this point years ago, that capitalism is the enemy of all racism because capitalism exacts a huge price from anybody who practices racism. On the other hand, of course, if you're running the government, there's no price for it. But capitalism does exact that price. And the research that was done by the Boston Fed was pretty bogus. But here's a quote from Janet Reno, because I just want to underscore the fact that this was pretty serious. She wrote, in our view, she said in a Senate Banking Committee testimony, Janet Reno was the Attorney General under Clinton at the time. In our view, the lending industry should be subject to the type of investigation that our department has conducted for many years in other civil rights areas, including the review of all components of an institution's operation over an extended period of time. It is particularly important to focus on the lender's marketing, branching, and advertising practices. Well, this helps put the worst on top. This helps put people in charge who don't look at a person's credit history. They just look at whether he's black or not. There were cases. There were lawsuits brought. There were banks that were already beginning to issue non-traditional mortgages out of fear that they might be named by the likes of Janet Reno in lawsuits. So this really was an issue. I want to kiss it off briefly with some research. Now, this is from the year 2000, and I jokingly call it Discrimination Against Whites. It turns out that in the year 2000, at least, this was a Fed and Civil Rights Commission study, it turns out that 44.6% of African Americans were turned down for a conventional mortgage, which, by the way, means that most of them were given a mortgage. 22.3% of whites were turned down, and 12.4% of Asian Americans. Now, this would mean, of course, that the banks had a completely reverse racist policy. They were basically favoring Asians and Native Hawaiians. They were only using that as a signal, and they were discriminating against whites. Well, probably there was some idea about who was a good credit risk, and that they were reasonably racially blind. That's how silly it was, but it did make a difference. It did help put the worst on top. It was an assault on the credit culture by this particular move. Now I want to approach it from a different standpoint about how the worst got on top. I'm going to talk about a sacred cow called deposit insurance. Now, in 1990, the insurance limit on anything you put in a bank was raised from $40,000 to $100,000. And by January 2003, something that really took off, deposit insurance was effectively unlimited with the advent of what's called CDARS, the Certificate of Deposit Account Registry Service. By the way, the guy who was big and behind it was an economist from Princeton named Alan Blinder, who was a governor at the Federal Reserve. And the way CDARS essentially work is that any amount of money you want federally protected, be it $50 million, $60 million, all you have to do is bring it to a particular bank, and through the Certificate of Deposit Account Registry Service, they'll swap it out, and they'll put you into however many banks you need to be registered at in order for your money to be protected. So you're officially under a lot of different banks so that you can qualify for federal deposit insurance. And this was openly done. There was no problem with it. But what it effectively meant is that a particular break on how banks operate, which is that they might lose customers if their profits are down, if they look a little shaky. Not even if there necessarily will be runs on the bank, but you just don't want to go to that bank if it's got a bad name in different ways. But all the banks were protected, even against losses from very rich customers who might be especially concerned because of CDARS. And here is a quote I like, and it's a little, I don't tell you who said it. It was one president's skepticism about deposit insurance, that deposit insurance would lead to laxity in bank management and carelessness on the part of both banker and depositor. That was Franklin D. Roosevelt talking in October of 1932. It's probably the smartest thing he ever said. He, by the way, continued to be skeptical about federal, to his credit, he continued to be skeptical about federal deposit insurance. It was part of the Glass-Steagall Act, so, and he had to ultimately accept it. But really, there's a mistake which I try to emphasize when people even talk about carelessness on the part of both banker and depositor. It's not just that the bankers become careless. It's that careless bankers get on top. It's that in finance especially, or I'm sure in almost every industry, there are always the crapshooters. There are always the irresponsible kids. There are always, and indeed, to some degree, probably every organization should have a few of these people. They just shouldn't be running the show. But when there is no downside, when people who don't know anything about credit get on top because you have to protect the bank against racist accusations of racism, or when there's no leash on the bank because it doesn't matter, you're not going to lose any of your depositors because of full protection from the federal government, then the careless bankers get on top. One other factor I'm going to mention, which is a subtle one, the lack of shareholder ombudsmen. I'm going to quote from Charles Calomiris and explain this. Charles Calomiris is a professor at Columbia in finance. He's written a great many good things about what happened during the bubble. And he objects as follows, that government regulations limiting who can buy stock in banks made effective corporate governance within large financial institutions virtually impossible, which allowed bank management to pursue investments that were unprofitable for stockholders in the long run, but that were very profitable to management in the short run. It turns out there are a whole set of rules and regulations that make it impossible for a hedge fund or for a private equity firm to own a controlling interest in a bank. There cannot, the very thing that a hedge fund or private equity firm, or to some degree a mutual fund, but hedge funds are most interesting, would be perhaps good at, which is to buy a controlling interest in a bank or in another financial institution and shape its policies and make sure it's prudent in its policies. That is forbidden by law for reasons we can go into, but those aren't very good reasons. It's actually lawyers, put it this way, we can summarize it briefly. Lawyers don't believe in concentration of ownership. You know, there's too much power that these financial institutions have. It escapes, economists know that when there's skin in the game, when a hedge fund has a huge interest in a bank, in a holding company, it's going to care about its investment. And it's going to make sure that certain practices that don't make sense are not done, or at least it's going to try to make sure that that happens. And so the absence of these ombudsmen, that is forbidden as a matter of law, also helps put the worst on top.